across the globe, people face threats to their communities in the name of development programs, usually involving the private sector. Because of the negative experience of many communities with the practices of businesses, especially multinational corporations, civil society has been finding ways to deal with private sector and development. Organizations under the CSO Partnership for Development Effectiveness, or CPDE, asked all development actors to ensure that the private sector adheres to development effectiveness principles and standards for human rights, labor, and transparency and accountability. More specifically, CPDE urged businesses to abide by guidelines set by the International Labour Organization, the United Nations, and the OECD. CPDE asserts that states should play the central role in providing public goods and services and universal social protection. Concretely, CPDE proposes ending development financing for businesses that privatize basic social services, undermine people's livelihood, and increases inequality. Further, CPDE calls on governments and civil society to work together to ensure the highest standards for transparency and accountability. CPDE advocates the protection of communities' development rights and the promotion of small and medium-sized enterprises and local entrepreneurs in support of national industrialization. Finally, CPDE demands the strengthening of labor protection and the promotion of the right to collective bargaining, trade union formation, and collective action. CPDE, in its various roles in the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, engaged in the development of the Kampala Principles on Effective Private Sector Engagement in Development Cooperation. Endorsed by the Steering Committee of the Global Partnership in Kampala, Uganda in March 2019, the 5 principles are: Principle 1. Inclusive country ownership, strengthening coordination, alignment, and capacity building at the country level. Principle 2. Results and targeted impact, realizing sustainable development outcomes through mutual benefits. Principle 3. Inclusive partnership, fostering trust through inclusive dialogue and consultation. Principle 4. Transparency and accountability, measuring and disseminating sustainable development results for learning and scaling up of successes. Principle 5. Leave no one behind, recognizing, sharing, and mitigating risks for all partners. CPDE welcomed the development of the Kampala Principles as a step towards a more effective and accountable engagement of the private sector in development cooperation. However, it remains critical of responding to sustainable development problems with market solutions. CPDE asserts that GPEDC must assess the implementation and implications of the Kampala Principles' voluntary nature, the pursuit of blended finance, and other arrangements consistent with development effectiveness principles, labor, accountability, and other international human rights standards. CPDE acknowledges the significant role the private sector can play in development and development cooperation, but experience shows this is far from reality. In the end, only through genuine changes in communities can such standards as the Kampala Principles have real meaning. In 2011, Maria joined her parents and dozens of others from their small village in the streets of Koihake to protest the project. The mobilizations grew bigger and bigger. By June 2014, the government scrapped the project. This story has a happy ending. But for countless others, the struggle continues to make development serve the people. CPDE then continues to engage in the advocacy inspired by the vision of villages like Maria's someday enjoying this possibility.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for the launch of the Private Sector Watch Global Synthesis Report 2023, hosted by the CSO Partnership for Development Effectiveness and the Reality of Aid Global Network. My name is Josefina Villegas. I am the Policy and Membership Coordinator for CPDE, and I'll be today's facilitator for this event. So before we start, I'll just run quickly through the Zoom protocol for today. First of all, interpretation is available. We have Spanish and French interpretation. To hear your desired language, kindly click on the globe icon on the bottom, right bottom of your Zoom app and choose the language of your preference. Also, please click on mute other audio to avoid any audio interference. As well, if you want to access the content that's being shared through the screen in the language of your preference, please click on the view options at the upper part of the screen and select the preferred language for the presentation. The Private Sector Watch is an initiative of the CPDE Task Force on Private Sector Engagement. The PSETF was originally convened in May 2021 with the aim to facilitate the implementation of the Private Sector Watch initiative and represent CPDE in various engagements with regard to private sector monitoring. The Private Sector Engagement Task Force is led by the Reality of Aid Global Network and is composed of volunteer civil society organizations. As development finance is under strain and as development finance is under strain as it responds to severe global crisis, the private sector has been held up as a silver bullet to fill in the gaps in development that governments and multilateral institutions are unable to address. With this, there is a need to ensure that private sector entities promote responsible business behavior in development cooperation, promoting accountability, adhering to the development effectiveness principles, and upholding the human rights-based approach. In this context, CPDE's initiative on private sector engagement is twofold monitoring, exiting PSC projects, is a twofold monitoring exiting PSC projects through the Private Sector Watch and conducting outreach to social enterprises as potential partners in development cooperation through the action research on key actors in the social enterprises sector. Concretely, today we'll be presenting the PS Watch initiative and the Global Synthesis Report. The CPDE Private Sector Watch aims to monitor private sector engagement in development cooperation through case studies from the network's constituencies. Under the PS Watch, constituencies looked into specific countries' initiatives where private sector entities are partnering with governments for development, its impact on specific sectors of society, and their compliance with the Kampala principles. These case studies are compiled into a global synthesis report, which we are now presenting, and an online hub. Last year, we released the first global synthesis report and the online hub, and today we are launching the second global synthesis report and new data that will be available on the online hub as well. To present the key findings and recommendations of this year's report, I call on Tala Batangan of the CPDE Private Sector Engagement Task Force and the Reality of Aid Global Network. Tala?
Thank you so much, Joe, and thanks everyone for attending the launch today. So as mentioned by Joe, we're launching the second synthesis report that we did this year. So it's a follow-up to the report that we launched last year. And this report has a total of 9 case studies from all over the globe, and it's represented also with the feminist, rural, indigenous peoples, and youth sectors as well. So from these case studies, we have learned of the following key findings, and we have forwarded the following policy recommendations. So next slide, please. So the first key finding that we have, which is also consistent with what we found in the first report, is that there is still a prominence of public-private partnerships or PPPs to finance large-scale infrastructure projects, which we found has led to short-term gains in infrastructure investment, but fundamentally compromise inclusiveness, resilience, and sustainability of development measures and practices. So, as we have seen in the past, PPPs have been often criticized for the unfair distribution of risks, especially for the public sector, as it incurs debt and shoulders much of the burden of these projects. So, in the report, we see the large-scale transport infrastructure in the form of the Nairobi Expressway in Kenya and the Shillong Doki Expansion Road project in Northeast India and the Lusaka and Dollar Road in Zambia. And we see that donor and private sector partners have benefited the most as transport services failed to improve, additional jobs were not generated for the local population, it amassed additional debt for the government, and contributed to environmental degradation with the large-scale construction of these highways and roads. And aside from physical infrastructure, we also see the entry of the private sector in digital infrastructure, especially in the case of the Huawei Safe City solution in Belgrade, Serbia, which allowed and gave control over digital public infrastructure and data to a private corporation, which reaches on people's rights and freedoms with increased state surveillance as well. Another trend is the accelerating corporatization of climate responses that facilitate corporate takeovers of sustainable energy initiatives to the detriment of local communities and long-term national development prospects. This is rooted in the fact that donors have also failed to uphold their climate finance commitments and instead push for greater private financing to pursue false and market-based solutions, much to the detriment and much to the worsening of the current climate crisis. In the report, we see that in the name of the energy transition, there is the construction of large-scale renewable energy infrastructure in Cordillera, Philippines, and Benban in Egypt, which is able to mobilize largely private sector partners and corporate partners to implement these infrastructure projects, but often led to the violations of indigenous people's rights and failure to mitigate adverse impacts on the project, on the communities, and the environment. Not just limited to the project, some case studies also tackle the overall context of private sector engagement in their own countries. And we see that there is a harmful long-term impact of certain types of private sector interventions on national development through the imposition of policy conditionalities and often legitimizing private sector engagement rather than upholding public interests. So we see that international financial institutions have long imposed policy conditionalities that promoted liberalization and privatization, much to the interest of the private sector. In Egypt, we see that policies like this have created private monopolies who dominate the national economy, profiting much of the country's resources. And meanwhile, in Zambia, we see that private sector engagement and its development plans has failed to build national industries and instead promoted reliance on private capital for development initiatives. And we see that overall, private sector interventions have often lacked inclusiveness, transparency, and accountability, with increasing constraints on civil society engagement. The lack of transparency of governments and private sector actors have limited the participation of civil society in monitoring and assessing development projects. Furthermore, the trend of shrinking civic space globally has also hindered communities and organizations from participating in relevant processes as they are subjected to increased threats and attacks. However, on a more positive note, we also see that micro, small, and medium enterprises and social enterprises as compelling alternatives to traditional corporate-led private sector engagement, especially with their more positive contributions to poverty reduction and inclusive growth. So we see that while there is a tendency for governments to prioritize partnering with large multinational corporations, cases from the report also show how MSMEs and SEs can be effective partners for development, but face more challenges in accessing financing and support. We see this in the report in Coca Colombia, which exemplifies how young, small-scale landowners and farmers have collectively forwarded alternative means of production as a sign of resistance to the dominant market-based economy in the country. Meanwhile, in Africa, the social enterprise Ataragana was able to provide economic opportunities to widows who experience discrimination in their own communities. And lastly, we also see that the potential of the Kampala Principles as a useful framework in guiding private sector engagement initiatives towards more equitable and sustainable outcomes. While the report showed that the principles have not been upheld by large multinational corporations and other private sector partners, because they remain voluntary and non-binding. So it poses hindrance to exacting accountability from these private sector partners. However, we see that these principles can be effective as guidelines for the formulation of concrete development aims during the planning stages, or using them to assess and evaluate private sector intervention after implementation, which is what this report does. We also highlight the need to continue monitoring compliance of private sector entities, not just with the Kampala principles, but with other human rights, labor norms, and environmental standards, in order to ensure that the people and planet are prioritized over profit. Moving on to the recommendation, so given these trends, the task force forwards the following recommendation. First is that government should review and in some cases revoke approval for current private sector engagement projects that promote corporate and donor interests at the expense of sustainable pro-people development. In this case, states should investigate and strongly respond to these projects that have led to adverse impacts on communities and the environment. Second is that governments must ensure as early as the proposal and planning stages that private sector initiatives are geared to contribute to democratically owned development plans at the national and subnational levels. These plans should put primacy on public finance, uphold state responsibility in providing basic goods and services, and champion national industrialization and agriculture. Development plans must also guide private sector financing to go towards underinvested sectors and least targeted SDGs. In conducting its business and development initiatives, we also urge the private sector entities must comply with international standards and regulations regarding labor, gender, the environment, and other human rights issues. To monitor this, governments must further develop oversight and regulatory mechanisms to ensure that the private sector upholds these standards and the Kampala principles. These mechanisms should have multi-stakeholder consultations and dialogue, monitor transparency and accountability of these entities, and ensure risks are shared by all development actors. Adequate support and efforts towards CSOs must be provided by the government to strengthen their monitoring role. Another recommendation we forward is that governments must support and encourage alternative, non-corporate modalities of private sector engagement that have been proven capable of producing positive social and environmental outcomes. This entails passing policies that provide government support, assistance, and access to financing tools for MSMEs and social enterprises. This also should ensure the representation in development processes. Furthermore, development actors should create an enabling environment for CSOs to monitor business operations and hold governments and private sector actors accountable. Development actors should recognize the contribution of CSOs in monitoring and exacting accountability of the private sector. And given the trend of shrinking civic space, CSOs should be ensured of their safety and security in monitoring and engaging with business operations and private sector engagement. Lastly, for CSOs, they must maximize their platforms to consistently and concretely advocate for better development strategies. So they have been doing this in solidarity with affected communities and marginalized sectors by conducting research, campaigns, and engaging with other development actors to assert that development financing must primarily be sourced from public funds and address people's needs. And CSOs have long supported movements on the ground that push back against private sector domination in development processes and forward a people-centered, rights-based development for all. So that's it for my overview of the key findings and recommendations. You can check more and read more on this in the Global Synthesis Report, and later we'll also have some of the case studies to be discussed by our contributor. So thanks. I'll go giving it back to Joe.
Thank you, Tala. Right on time. So I know that that's a lot of information. The presentation will be shared with everyone. There were also some very mild problems with the PowerPoint, but again, we'll share the presentation, and the recommendations are there in the report itself. So the team thought it would be interesting and enriching for everyone to also hear from some specific case studies that contributed to the development of these reports and, of course, the development of these recommendations and key findings highlighted by Tala. So for the first spotlight on these case studies, these are going to be videos, actually. We're going to have Isa de la Cruz. Isa de la Cruz from the International Indigenous Peoples Movement for Self-Determination and Liberation. She will be sharing more about their case study, hydropower projects and impacts on Cordillera Indigenous peoples. So I think we just move first with this case study and then we move on to the following ones. Thank you.
Of these hydropower dam projects voiced out their concerns and engaged in lobbying and dialogue with local government officials. They have expressed their concerns over the proposed height of the dams, which will flood their communities, destroy their agricultural livelihood, and displace them from their ancestral lands. Community organizations, their leaders and members who stood against the construction of these dams, experienced harassment and attacks through many forms, such as death threats, forced disappearances and abductions by state and military forces, red tagging or terrorist tagging, and militarization of their communities. Under the Kampala principles, these hydropower development projects fail to take into account the rights, issues, and concerns of indigenous peoples over their ancestral lands, their livelihoods, and the environment. There is a stress on the commercialization and privatization of renewable energy resources and infrastructure, putting indigenous peoples at risk of displacement, loss of lands, and loss of livelihood. This is a death spell for indigenous peoples whose lives and collective identities are deeply rooted in their ancestral lands. In terms of transparency and accountability, it must be noted that a very significant obstacle in our research was the lack of public access to information and data on these development projects. There were no accessible monitoring studies and accountability systems either. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples enshrines the right of indigenous peoples to self-determination and development. That indigenous peoples have the right to freely determine and develop priorities and strategies for the development or use of their lands, territories, and other resources. That their free, prior, and informed consents must be obtained prior to the approval of projects which will affect them, their lands, resources, and territories, and that effective mechanisms for redress and appropriate measures to mitigate adverse impacts must be implemented. However, our research on these projects uncovered how government agencies and even corporations violate the right of indigenous peoples to free, prior, and informed consent. In some cases, large hydropower dams were allowed to be constructed even without the FPIC. The proposed dam projects cited in our research were awarded contracts by the Department of Energy even without going through the procedure of obtaining an FPIC. The destructive development projects such as the ones being proposed in the Cordillera region gravely affect indigenous peoples, their ways of living, culture, and survival. We need a development framework that recognizes the rights and concerns of the people and environment over profit. These are just some of the photos of the historic resistance of the Cordillera indigenous peoples against the entry of destructive and aggressive development projects funded by the World Bank and other international financial institutions, and against militarization, commercial logging, and etc. Until today, indigenous peoples continue to struggle for the right to land, development, and self-determination. Thank you very much.
I hope everyone was able to see the video in the end. And we will now be moving on to the next case study featuring Dijana Stevkovsky from the Civic Initiatives to present Safe City Solutions in Serbia Threatened Civic Space. Tala, is it also a video that we're featuring?
Yes. Please wait for a while. We're trying to play it.
Okay.
The story begins in February 2017 when the Serbian Ministry of Interior signed a strategic partnership agreement with the Chinese multinational corporation Huawei to introduce safe city solutions in the Serbian public security system. As it was officially announced, the project aims to ensure better traffic control and prevent crime by deploying Huawei surveillance technology and systems across the city of Belgrade. However, Serbian civil society has raised alarm on the safe city project's use of surveillance technology, as it is predisposed to violating people's basic rights and freedoms. Furthermore, in facilitating the implementation of the project, the Ministry of Interior has attempted to amend several laws to legitimize state surveillance. The initiatives was also being pursued at the time when there was an increase in the attacks toward civil society and further shrinking of civic space by the state. Assessing the case, we concluded that the Kampala principles were almost completely disrespected. There was evident lack of inclusive country ownership. The public security reform foreseen by the project is not mentioned in any relevant strategic documents. Individual policy documents fail to undergo an inclusive and participative process of civil society. To provide a legal basis for the project, the Serbian Ministry of Interior amended core laws and proposed a draft law on internal affairs which allows for increased surveillance by authorities. Speaking about results and target impact, no evaluation of the project development and impact has been conducted. In 2019, the Commissioner for Personal Data Protection found that the data protection impact assessment of the Safe City project failed to assess risks related to the human rights. The project also violates country laws on personal data protections, as the risks exposed to the rights of freedom of citizens are not proportionate to the benefits of its use. Regarding the principle of inclusive partnerships, the whole process of implementing the projects lacked transparency. Since the beginning, domestic and international rights groups strongly opposed to it. Even 14,000 citizens signed a petition to stop the project. In August 2021, the Ministry of Interior published the draft law on internal affairs, which seeks to legalize widespread real-time biometric surveillance, providing a legal basis for the Safe City project. Serbian CSOs has criticized the draft law as a threat to people's fundamental rights and freedoms, and that it lacks justification for the use of mass surveillance technology. The draft law also received backlash from international actors who stated that the law violates Serbia's ratification of European Convention on Human Rights, especially the right to privacy. Concerning transparency and accountability, the Ministry of Interior has used the project's character as being related to public security, to fully shield from accountability in its implementation. All contracts related to the project have been declared confidential. The project descriptions has even been removed from Huawei website. Both Serbian public officials and Chinese company representatives routinely denied requests to comment the content of that strategic agreement. And still there is no publicly available information about the project objectives, timeline, expected and achieved results. So it is impossible for civil society and other stakeholders to monitor the project implementation and its impact. Finally, about Principle 5, recognizing, sharing and mitigating risks for all partners, and based on the publicly available information, there is no framework in place to identify and mitigate risks posed by the Safe City projects. Furthermore, there has been no justifications for the role of Huawei in the project, and there is a completely lack of mechanisms to safeguard data protection and human rights standards against business interests. Having in mind all above mentioned, our key recommendations would be for state and its private sector partners to do no harm, to stop any form of state surveillance that violates people's rights, and ensure that a human rights-based approach is adopted for development and security initiatives. In partnering with private sector entities, government must provide significant oversight and effectively regulate their business activities and interventions in developing and security initiatives. Business activities must be aligned with international human rights and labor norms and standards. Governments must be transparent and accountable in implementing security programs. Last but not least, provide avenues for inclusive and meaningful dialogue with civil society and ensure effective, accessible grievance and redress mechanisms.
Lastly, we have Patricia Akakpo from NetRight Ghana to share their research, social enterprises, and economic empowerment of women in Ghana.
Women's economic rights in the Upper East region of Ghana. Upper East region is in the northern part of Ghana. And WOM has successfully leveraged its social enterprise known as Atara Ghana, which was established in 2013 to empower women and promote sustainable development. Scale up what the women are already doing. So it's not like bringing a new program for the women to engage in, but what you're already working on, jobs that they are familiar with, such as basket and cloth weaving, such as producing bamboo and shell products. That's what they together work with the women to generate income for the widows. So in doing that, so that kind of ownership is there. So they work with their target groups to ensure that their products and value is added to their products, they have access to their markets, and they are able to secure income for secure their livelihoods. They also contribute to forwarding women's rights, focusing on the recognition, reduction, and redistribution of unpaid care and women's access and control over land and other productive resources. When you look at, they have a target, their target is women. And then within women, they are looking at those in vulnerable situations and they target widows. So in all that they do, the raw materials that they source for, they are all done by widows. Atara has provided sustainable income opportunities, as I mentioned, to over 300 women and seasonal income for 400 women. And it's targeted. So then you see the impact. You see these widows that do not have income, do not have secured livelihoods, could not cater for their families, being in a position to have incomes for themselves through the work that they do with Atara to be able to support themselves. When we talk about inclusive partnership, I think when you look at inclusive ownership, before you would even be able to say that this is inclusively owned, the people feel they are part of it, then it means you set up on an equal playing ground. So what Atara does is to work with the women, partner with them as equal partners. And Atara also partner with other development actors, including foundations, donor countries, civil society, the private sector, and academia in ensuring that assistance is provided to the programs. That varies from partner to partner. And this include financial resources, this include technical assistance, and this include capacity development. When it comes to transparency and accountability, I think we can also learn lessons from there because WOM through Atara produces annual reports that detail the impacts and outcomes of its initiatives. These also have detailed financial reports of how they utilize the funding from their donors and partners. So yes, whilst they are working through micro, small, and medium enterprises owned by women to ensure that they secure their livelihoods, to ensure that they generate income, they also partner with other development actors. One of the Kampala principles also looks at recognizing, sharing, and mitigating risks for all partners. And how does Atara do that? As the source of income of these women is dependent on their natural environment, they recognize that they also have to contribute to environment sustainability. So they work as partners. They do recognize that we are using natural resources to secure our livelihoods. So it is important for us all as a collective. So it doesn't become a responsibility for one person, but it becomes a collective responsibility to protect the environment, to ensure environmental sustainability. With the Babwa and Share Trees being indigenous to Northern Ghana, the women have the responsibility to foster climate resilient sustainability agricultural practices. Also, equipping women with entrepreneurial and vocational skills has enabled them to secure better employment opportunities. They are able to start their own businesses and contribute to the local economy as a whole.
The projects tackled in these case studies are also uploaded in the PS Watch online hub. So in case you want to listen to this again and to go over this information once again, you can access it through the online hub. The online hub works as an online repository of information on private sector engagement in development cooperation. And in order to show you how it's used, we will be showing a short video to walk you through the online hub.
In the recent years, the private sector has emerged as a key development actor. It has been given a role in defining, pursuing, and financing development. However, the profit-seeking nature of businesses can present a conflict with development objectives and actors. Because of this, regular monitoring by civil society organizations is necessary. CSOs can keep track of private sector engagements and ensure the welfare of communities and the protection of the environment. The Private Sector Watch is initiated by the CSO Partnership for Development Effectiveness and the Reality of Aid Network. It aims to monitor and assess private sector engagement in different country contexts. What is the Private Sector Watch? The Private Sector Watch is an online repository of information featuring specific initiatives where private sector entities are partnering with governments and other development actors for development outcomes. Case studies come from CPDE implementing units from across the globe. As a CSO database, the Private Sector Watch aims to monitor effectiveness of private sector engagement or PSE in development cooperation. Assess private sector entities' adherence to the Kampala principles. Provide evidence for CSO advocacies and policy recommendations on private sector engagement. Strengthen capacities of CSOs in monitoring and appraising the effectiveness of private sector engagement in their own contexts. Explore the Private Sector Watch. Zoom in on the map and look into specific projects. The colored pins designate the kind of private sector entity engaged. Green for social enterprises, yellow for multinational corporations, orange for large domestic corporations, blue for both multinational and domestic corporations. To know more about a specific project, click on the pin and a pop-up will open. The pop-up will provide a glimpse on the development project. Still curious? Click the Show Details button to review the project profile. The project profile will show a link to the full research of the project and the details on the project's financing, sector, modality, partners, Kampala Principles Assessment, impact on specific sectors. Looking for a specific project? Use the search function or filters for kind of private sector engaged, location of the project, range of financing, sector of the project, concerned population. For more information, refer to the Research and Handbook on Private Sector Engagement in Development Cooperation. Know more about the work of the CPDE Private Sector Engagement Task Force by going to www.csopartnership.org and www.realityofaid.org.
So we hope the video was useful in helping you navigate through the Private Sector Watch online hub, in case you hadn't been there already. And we also hope that the Private Sector Watch initiative will be useful to other development actors, such as governments, private sector entities, and multilateral institutions. We have two panel reactors to provide insights and feedback on what has been presented today. So first, I would like to call on Thomas Boehler, Policy Analyst on Global Partnerships and Policies for the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate. And yeah, first, Thomas, please go ahead.
Hi, Josefina. Hi, colleagues. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real great pleasure to be here and seeing a lot of colleagues and friends. I have to say, maybe my first reaction is that I'm really very heartened to see the application of the Kampala principles in so many different country settings. When we started out with this work about 5-6 years ago, after the Nairobi high-level meeting of the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, where there was really the first time where at the global level, the concerns about private sector engagement in development cooperation were raised. This was exactly our ambition, and I'm glad we're here today. We've come away, but there's still quite a lot to be done, and I think the excellent report that you presented today and the different case studies also go to show that private sector engagement in many ways is still in its infancy when it comes to ensuring that it delivers for people and planet and for those furthest behind. I want to make maybe 3 points and really start from the idea of making sure that the quality of private sector engagement is as important as the discussion, that it's much more prominent around the mobilization of private finance. You mentioned in the beginning, Tala, that the private sector has been seen as a silver bullet to finance and realize the SDGs. I think the verdict is still out on this, but from our perspective, from the global partnership and all our stakeholders, the quality of partnerships with the private sector are very critical to reinstate trust in all the different actors to actually help mobilize the resources needed at a time when ODA is under tremendous strain and at a time of many competing crises that I don't have to go into much detail on because we all know about those. So my 3 points, one is on the issues and on the substance, one is on specific tools and instruments we can use, and maybe then a third point on next steps and suggestions on how we can synergize and collaborate. On the issues, I think the stars are very much aligned between the Kampala principles and the case study findings. I had 5 points I wanted to make on this. The first one is, I think the case studies show, as much as the Kampala principles also raise the question of whether private sector engagement is in all cases the right solution. This is a question that really is important for governments to keep in mind as they engage in public-private partnerships or other engagements with the private sector. And I think it is up to all of us to shed an eye on this and make sure that governments keep that question front and center as they engage in private sector engagement projects. The second point that's very much linked to this is around the lack of adequate policies and strategies for private sector engagement in countries and results frameworks. When we did the original 1,000 projects that we analyzed in 4 countries in 2017 and 18, and we can share the links to those in Bangladesh, Egypt, Uganda, and El Salvador, we felt that one of the biggest challenges was that there's no inbuilt monitoring and evaluation or results or accountability frameworks in many of the private sector partnerships, half of which were blended finance projects. And we've worked very hard also within the OECD and with colleagues that work on blended finance and other modalities of financing to start and close this gap, but this is really a big challenge still at this point. The third point is around the inclusiveness of dialogue and the clamping down on civic space. I think that has been articulated quite well in the presentations earlier on, and this is something that's very critical, ensuring all the stakeholders are at the table. Private sector engagement is not about the private sector and the government, it is about all the different stakeholders, including civil society, trade unions, social enterprises, and all other partners. The fourth point is around risk sharing. I think one of the big challenges that comes out quite a lot is that there's a disproportionate risk on the governments and on the people to actually make do with the impact of the private sector engagement projects. And the private sector itself and also the development partners would have a much higher due diligence to make sure that in the planning stages of private sector engagement projects, the potential implications of these projects and programs are analyzed and assessed to sort of mitigate those risks before the projects are implemented. And the last point on this, on the substance for me, is around the different modalities for private sector engagement. Most of them are of financial nature. The ones that you've highlighted in the report are largely energy and infrastructure, PPPs. Obviously, those are very important and those have potential to do a lot of good and a lot of harm, but there's also a lot of other private sector engagement modalities, including through knowledge sharing, including through smaller kinds of partnerships that are not as institutionalized as big, large-scale PPPs. And we think those are equally important, and you've highlighted that as well. But I just want to underline that point, that partnerships with micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, with cooperatives, with social enterprises, through private sector development at the country level are really critical. The second point on the tools to use to raise awareness. We have two tools that are, from our perspective, really very exciting and very complementary with the Private Sector Watch. On the one hand, there's the new Kampala Principle Assessment, which is part of the new monitoring of the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, that has 4 metrics for 5 different stakeholder groups, 4 governments, 4 private sector, 4 development partners, for civil society, and for trade unions. They're around the policy environment, around the dialogue structures, around the quality of partnerships, including due diligence and grievance processes, and around the ease of partnering with development partners. And we encourage you to take a look at those and make sure that also in the countries that conduct the Kampala Principle Assessment as part of the monitoring over the next couple of years, and we can share in the chat who those countries are. For now, I think the only overlap with the case study countries is the Philippines, but there are many more to come. It's really important to raise awareness among civil society in those countries and among other stakeholders in those countries of this exercise, to approach the government, to participate and sit at the table, to discuss among civil society actors at the country level about the state of these different issues and metrics, to provide very informed responses that the government can then take into account. And we will aggregate for country results briefs that then will be evidence that you can use at the country level to have a more informed basis for your debates and negotiations with governments and other stakeholders. So we think this is really an important and exciting tool, and we're very happy because this is a module of the monitoring that is here to stay, and we're working very hard to mobilize other countries to also undertake the Kampala Principle Assessment, and we count also on the support of civil society to do so. There are challenges in this, including mobilizing the right focal points for private sector that engage in this. We will see that progress is probably very little. Many countries won't have all the features that we ask about in place, but even if we have a low baseline, we will have a baseline that you can start from, and it's important to raise awareness of the gaps and deficits. And so for this, I think it's really important to invest in this. And at the same time, it's also important to stay true to the principle of country ownership and realize that it takes time to make progress on this, and that the government will need to be in charge and lead around this, and all other actors should push to be engaged in this process. The second tool is and I'm coming to the end in a minute, sorry, I know I'm a bit long, is the Kampala Principle Toolkit. The toolkit is a set of very detailed self-assessment questions, examples, and pitfalls around the Kampala principles and their different metrics and sort of sub-principles for each of the stakeholder groups. So I encourage you to also look at the one for civil society actors in particular, but also for the ones for other actors, to use as a basis for your discussions. In terms of next steps, I think it's important to explore together how to present also the Private Sector Watch in different fora. There will be a session at the Busan Global Partnership Forum on the 5th and 6th of December in Korea, where this is being presented, and we're very happy about this, but there's probably many other opportunities, including also at the DAC CSO group. I was thinking when I was reading the report, given the increased importance of locally led development for providers of the Development Assistance Committee, that it might be quite useful to also see whether we can link up with this part of the global debate. from our perspective, it's important to highlight what works well and the positive examples as much as the negative ones, but really to also look at the incentives for behavior change. And so inspiring positive stories are really important. And also the integrated thinking that you follow by linking up development and climate issues, by linking up civic rights and human rights issues with the development agenda. I think this is hugely important. And lastly, there is a group of friends of the Kampala Principles that is part of the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation. And I invite all of you to also join this, and we can share information on that. Thanks a lot, Josefina. Thanks.
Thank you, Thomas, for those insights and for all the tools and resources you've shared also with your team through the chat box. We are also joined by Jeru Vilimoria from Catalyst 2030, a global movement led by social entrepreneurs to advance progress towards Agenda 2030. We are a bit behind on schedule, so I hope everyone can stay around for about 10 more minutes. That would allow us to wrap up the launch together. Jeru, the floor is yours.
Hi.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'll be brief, so you don't have to run too much over. I am joined. I'm joined here by my colleague Larissa also, who actually looks after private sector engagement. I would like to compliment you all on the launch of the report and some very, very important findings. So compliments and thank you on the report launch. I really think it's very interesting, and we will share it in the Catalyst network. So I think that is something we can do, and on our newsletter, and Larissa will for sure take that forward along with our working group. I think Thomas made some very, very interesting points, and I would like to build on. And one is that if we have to work at the country level, we need to work in partnership and we need to work in collaboration. Catalyst has a lot of social enterprises who do work with the private sector. So I think it is very, very important that at the country level, wherever we are able to, that partnership can be taken and strengthened. My second point is that we do realize that businesses need to be monitored, as has been shown in the report, on how they are really engaging with the social sector. How are they really working on the SDGs? And rather than criticism, what Catalyst has tried to do is turn it into a positive framework where we are launching the Catalyst Business Commitment. The Catalyst Business Commitment essentially is a commitment where businesses self-declare what and how they are working with social enterprises and social entrepreneurs. So this is an open shout out to you, and Larissa will put her email in the chat also, that if you know businesses which are working with social entrepreneurs and we want to highlight them as good practices, it would be really nice to put them in touch, and they can then showcase what they are doing, how they are doing it, so they can become role models in the country to be able to take that forward. So I think in addition to monitoring and seeing how things are happening, and the report has highlighted some really crucial facts, building on what Thomas is saying in terms of partnership and making sure that partnership with the private sector is done in the right way, we can get businesses to sign on to the Catalyst Business Commitment. There are different levels which allow businesses to grow from a bronze level to a platinum level. And there are members like you whom we can use to take it forward also and help every business to become a shining star, and therefore actually rely on businesses to partner with us on equal terms with us as civil society and social enterprise to bring about the change that we need to be able to achieve the SDGs. My last point I want to say why Catalyst Business Commitment and why we really need to work in partnership is, Thomas said development aid is shrinking. Let me tell you, I was on a call with the business leaders of Europe, the business unicorns yesterday, on not a Catalyst thing, but on something else. All of them said they're cutting back on social sector spending because the economic climate is extremely difficult. Given this, I think the only way to change it is by giving them some amount of positive reinforcements to make the change happen. And I think that's where I will end. This report is fantastic. And let's try to build on how we are able to do it by watching the private sector, making sure they don't do some of the things which were highlighted in the case studies and otherwise in the report, but through positive encouragement, trying to shift it. So with this, I will hand back to you, Joe, to take over, and please reach out to Larissa if you have companies we are able to take this forward with. Thank you very much, and back to you, Joe.
Thank you, Jeru, for the feedback. I think my screen is. I have a problem with my computer, so I'm using two devices. That's why you're seeing Joe audio on the screen. But anyways, just thank you, Jeru, once again, and thank you, Thomas, once again for your feedback and your reactions to all the content that was shared today, all the tools. For now, we will wrap up today's lunch. But to end it, we want to welcome Matthew Simmons, our CPDE Senior Policy Officer and Liaison, to give the closing remarks for today's lunch.
Hi, everybody. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I'll be very brief with closing remarks. Mainly just to say thank you. First, to say thank you to Tala, really, and the task force on private sector engagement within CPD for really leading the work on the Private Sector Watch and pulling together the synthesis report, which I think is quite a good product. I think now what we need to do is think about how and where to use it. We know we have the Busan Forum of the GPDC taking place in Seoul, where we'll be able to present some of the findings of this report, including, I think, some of the positives and the negative examples of engaging with the private sector through development cooperation. I would then like also to thank our colleagues that presented the case studies, even by video, but the ones that actually undertook the case studies and produced the evidence and the content for this report, because without the ground level evidence, we wouldn't be able to pull together our recommendations, learning from the experiences and what happens on the ground, let's say. Then, of course, thanks to Thomas and Jeru for joining us today, for providing really, really helpful feedback. I think as sort of fervent advocates of the GPDC and effective development cooperation, and as a result or consequently, also advocates of the Kampala principles, we're really happy to continue promoting these. I think if I were to end with a reflection, as CSOs is a bit skeptical perhaps sometimes of the role of the private sector in terms of contributing to sustainable development through receiving development cooperation. We think that we do have the tools to make sure that there is an actual sustainable development impact when we sort of deploy development cooperation through the private sector. And I think the Kampala principles are one of the sort of gold standards for that, because they do bring in a lot of other international norms and standards and tools and instruments to ensure that there is accountability of the private sector, but also impact by the private sector. So our Private Sector Watch report tried to analyze how the Kampala principles are being used, and I think what we've seen is there's still a ways to go, but I think that's where also the Kampala Principle Toolkit is really helpful, because it cuts across all the different constituents that are engaged in development at the sort of all the different levels, especially development cooperation. And we have the Kampala Principles Assessment, and I can say that we're very much committed to engaging CSOs and really animating CSOs at the country level to engage this GPDC monitoring framework as a whole, but especially the KPAs, the KPA. So we're really looking forward to the first round, and I think one thing we will do as a platform and a network with CSOs at country level is really try to encourage governments to use the KPA, because we know it's actually at this point a voluntary part of the monitoring process, but we want to make sure that it's actually used, so that we can, be able to properly assess what the impact of the private sector is at the country level. So with that, I would close and say just again, thanks a lot to everybody for joining us. And please, share the report as far and wide as you like. Come back to us with feedback if you have any. And we look forward to continuing to have kind of conversations around this in the future. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Matt, for those closing remarks. Lastly, I would just like to say that we will be sending the Private Sector Watch report, an online hub, to all of the participants, as well as posting it in the CPDE and ROA social media. Also, if anybody is interested in receiving the PPT presentation, that can also be shared. We hope you can continue to support the work of the CPDE Private Sector Engagement Task Force in ensuring that we put the people and the planet over profit. So before everyone leaves, if it's okay with those that are still in the Zoom call, can we open up our cameras for a group photo as requested by our hosts and organizers? Thank you.
All right, taking a picture. 1, 2, 3. Another one. 1, 2, 3. All right, one more. 1, 2, 3. Thanks everyone for coming. Please check out the
Thank you.
report.
Thank you.